A former CIA Inspector General and the author of books entitled The Great Game, The Myth and Reality of Espionage, and Why Spy, Espionage in an Era of Uncertainty, Fred Hitz is a renowned expert on Edward Snowden. Following his graduation from Princeton University and Harvard Law School, Mr. Hitz worked for the CIA, practiced law, then returned to public service as a congressional liaison with the Departments of State, Defense, and Energy. Currently, Mr. Hitz is a senior lecturer in public policy at the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy, lecturer at the School of Law, and senior fellow at the Center for National Security at the University of Virginia. It is my pleasure to introduce CIA spy master, Mr. Fred Hitz, to More Than the Score.
Thank you, Cindy. Let me make sure I'm on. Can you hear me? Am I okay? And thank you all for coming. It's a beautiful day, so I won't keep you out of that sun for very long. I'm going to lead with my chin. I think Edward Snowden should turn himself in. I think he made a mistake in a way in not sort of, if he was determined to get this material out, putting it in a situation where it was out, it was unreachable, that's what he wanted to do, but at the same time, he was going to take responsibility for his actions. I think he puts himself in an odd position in exile in Russia. It's occurred to some of us old hands that perhaps his relationship to Putin is more than just as a stopping off place. But that being said, I don't want to say anything that would cast doubt on the sincerity of his purpose as he sees it. He really does believe, that the NSA, the National Security Agency, or as we used to say, no such agency, has exceeded all bounds in what's being done. And so in that sense, it's incumbent upon me to suggest some other ways he might have gone about it. Number one, he was a lot cleverer than his predecessors, Assange and Manning, in finding a way to get that material out and in such a fashion that it couldn't be stopped. They sort of got it in place before he did his thing. So in that sense, it's been a successful outing. But by the same token, if he wants to have if he or somebody in his position wants to have maximum impact, there are other ways of doing it than having broken the law and broken his commitment. Now, let me say as an aside, I have not been very happy at the large growth of the contractor community in the national security area. You can say because of the strains that 9/11 placed upon the nation, there was no other way to build up and cover all the bases. But as a former career intelligence officer, and with my relationships to other shops around Washington that did the same thing, there's nothing like being on the inside. Snowden would say probably to be captured and then turned. But I would say to fully understand the ramifications of all that is going on. And he clearly is a person of real ability, but he's always been one step away from the font. He was a contractor, as it turned out in the end, in Hawaii. He began to have second thoughts at the matters that came over his desk, but he had no clear place to go to share those concerns. Since that time, since he began his effort, the law has been changed so that there's an intermediate point. Porter Goss, who was chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and a very good one, started a bill moving in the Congress to deal with a specific problem the Congress thought they had. They thought that with the adherence that the executive branch agencies made their employees sign up to that a lot of information might not be getting from the intelligence community or the military to Capitol Hill, to the overseers. And so he didn't want to do anything, none of the Congress wanted to do anything that just cut off the notion of a whistleblower at the knees. But there had to be some kind of intermediate way to make sure one had access to all that was going on, short of making it available to the legislative branch or to all the world. And that's where, and again, you can fault me for being a homie here, but that's where the Office of Inspector General came in. Porter created legislation which later passed, which said if you, an employee of the CIA or the NSA or whatever it may be, feel that something's going on that is outside the realm of propriety or the law, go to the IG. The IG has a dual responsibility, not only to the head of the agency, but also to the President of the United States, in particular, to make sure that things are being done in the appropriate way. And I don't know, I couldn't tell you, that passed shortly after I left government service in '98. I don't know what the track record is on that particular device. I can imagine in certain areas it works well, but there would have to be trust in the notion that the Inspector General, appointed by the President but confirmed by the Senate, has the capability of sort of standing above the battle in that sense and recognizing when it's time to move. What I don't think is acceptable is what Snowden ended up doing, which is, in a protected way, Laura Poitras, Glenn Greenwald, her principal supervisors, they had the material, it was sure to come out, and it did. Something about NSA, National Security Agency, has a storied record in the United States. Before 1952, when it was created as a Defense Department intelligence agency by President Truman, it had existed in the military departments in which its signals collection capability first originated, the Army and the Navy in particular. And if you'll remember, both the Army and the Navy in particular, was able to get a remarkable entry into Japanese diplomatic traffic before the onset of World War II. It helped us very greatly. It didn't have access to the diplomatic code yet, but it had access to the military traffic. Secondly, with our relationship with the British, and this is a very important thing to note, we were able to get it on the front line of Bletchley Park. And that is that remarkable agglomeration of mathematicians and scientists who broke the German code. They got hold of a Polish-made Enigma machine, which they broke down and were able to read German military traffic from almost the earliest days of the war. In fact, if you'll remember, in order to get President Roosevelt to step up and do more than just make Lend-Lease sales to the British, Bletchley Park was used as the ammunition to show that Hitler's designs were to take over all of Europe. So NSA, the Army Security Agency at the time, the Army cryptographers, was part of that group working on this. It's a long and storied history. Since that time, of course, as things have become technologically more complex, and I hope you all have had a chance to look at your New York Times today, because there's a piece that suggests that the next wave of machines from Apple are going to contain codes that not even Apple says it's going to be able to break. So we may have a situation where technologically, whether there's a Snowden or not, we're not going to be able to get into the kind of exchange of information which ISIS and other groups of the Middle East are capable of doing now. seems to me that's something that the U.S. government ought to have a second crack at. So NSA is not is not one of these aggressive, let's try to build up our empire kinds of people, kinds of government agencies, but rather has a phenomenally important and massive job to do. If you'll remember, the latest, he's retired now, but General Alexander, who was head of the National Security Agency for a good many years, he said, "You talk about needle in a haystack, that's what I spend my entire day, every day, looking for." And they've been quite remarkable in that regard. Important point in that connection also is to notify, and this gives rise to part of the friction that exists between the United States and our European allies in particular. Remember when it was revealed several months ago now that we were listening to Angela Merkel's calls on her cell phone. That seemed a bit extreme, to put it mildly. That has discontinued. And I read also that a lot of the unilateral secret gathering among our European allies has been put on hold for the moment. But the fact of the matter is, from that World War II beginning, and the cooperation with the British in Bletchley Park, and later with the Australians and the New Zealanders and the Canadians in other parts of this hemisphere and in Asia, a tight bound was formed between the communications spy agencies of those nations. And that's one of the things, frankly, that the Europeans would like to gain entry to. If we're not going to allow them to share our secrets and be part of this operation, then they're going to take a very hostile attitude towards us. So, what is the job of NSA in this post 9/11 world? And let's be absolutely clear. That's is and should be the driving force. We're trying to find out what's going on in the minds of Al-Qaeda, now ISIS, these hostile elements. And the way to do that is to capture their conversations in every way we possibly can. This first presented itself during the George W. Bush administration, if you'll remember. After 9/11, people started to think. Those were attacks mounted by Al-Qaeda, but using foreign citizens. For the most part, the muscle hijackers, if you'll remember, were all Saudis. Saudis who had obtained their visas to come to the United States without even at that time having to present themselves to a U.S. embassy. They could get them through travel agents. That no longer exists. But the notion was, if it was going to be a situation where material like this could be exchanged internationally, didn't we have to worry about a situation where Al-Qaeda operatives in Europe, some of whom we had a line on, some of whom we suspected, might be trying to engage with American citizens who were disillusioned and who might be capable of answering the call. So that's when the program, and the Bush administration, as I say, went forward and did it unilaterally, did it as an executive branch situation with the president ordering it, and that led to a brouhaha with Congress so that they attempted to shut it down. What NSA was going to do was to capture the metadata, the person calling, the name of the person who received the call, the time of the call, but the substance of the call remaining in the hands of the telephone companies or the other agencies that had allowed the call to happen. That's what the situation is currently, only it's in multiples of instances. It's a lot bigger program than it was going back to those early days. So we are accumulating reams of metadata on the notion that sometime somebody in the Al-Qaeda world, in the hostile world, from outside is going to try to link up with an American, and we want to be able to have a record of that call. So vast, I have a sort of a personal interest in it. Our daughter lives in Salt Lake, outside of Salt Lake in the south, and it's down in Provo that this new installation is being put in. We didn't get to see it on the last trip out there, but I'm given to understand it is vast. The capacity to store this material is enormous. But that's what I want to emphasize. It's the capacity to store metadata and the permission to read the substance of what is exchanged in those messages. As I say, you've got the person who made the call, the person who received it, and the time. The ability to read those calls depends upon an order from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which was court glamorizes it a little bit because these are active federal district judges, presidential appointees confirmed by the Senate, sitting in district courts all over the United States with a requirement that 2 or 3 of them be within the Washington, D.C. area so they can be quickly called upon to look at these matters. They do not sit in courtrooms. They sit in a what I'm told is a rather exotic but not terribly glamorous a room above the Attorney General's office in the Department of Justice, and they are brought requests by the executive branch saying, we believe that X is a spy. We believe that X is a terrorist. We want to be able to listen to them talk. We want to look at their mail. We want to check them out. And that is brought to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, as the lawyers would say, ex parte. There's nobody representing the person who's going to be tapped. That, of course, should and does give us all a tremor, a moment of concern. But all the court is being asked to do is permit the government, on the basis of a suspicion that they have to make out to the court that this individual is a terrorist or a spy, the right to listen to these calls. Now, that's obviously something that's still very controversial, should be. It has to be checked from time to time. There are, in fact, some of these judges who are appointed on rotation. They don't. They're picked from sitting federal judges, and they will go back to the courts where they'd been appointed and confirmed after service on this court, have refused to serve. They felt that they, in good conscience, couldn't do it. But it's not what you call just a willy-nilly, open-the-door kind of permission. And that was created in law by Section 215 of the Patriot Act as amended. So if we want to get on top of this, we want to say this is too far, this is too much, then we have a vehicle that we can look at to make that change. The problem, that which overwhelmed Snowden, and probably overwhelms a number of you, is the volume of messages, admittedly in metadata form, that are being accumulated. And I think we may see, despite the creation of this new holding facility in Utah, we might see in time a review of whether it's necessary to capture as many of these messages as we are doing. Again, as I say, it's just in storage. It's only the metadata that's been obtained. The actual substance of what's being said, the notion of a plot for an assassination or something of that kind, isn't looked into unless there is corroborating information from another source. Bottom line, and then I'd like to turn it over to you for your views on this. One of the things that overwhelmed the United States generally and certainly the government in Washington in the wake of 9/11 was the enormity of the catastrophe. How many of you in this room have read the 50 pages in the 9/11 Commission report, all of which passed through the about to say the typewriter, the machine of Philip Zelikow, a colleague of mine in the history department? It's a marvelous piece to read. You just cannot believe that the United States should have been so nakedly unprepared for this event, where we had to scramble fighters to fly over the national capital region from as far away as Cape Cod, where there were others that couldn't deliver. It was just a situation where Mohammed Atta, I imagine to hear that recording now makes your fingers tremble. He got on the line to the control tower in New York saying, "We've got a couple of planes," and 3 minutes later he'd hit the World Trade Center. I have an aside on that. It was a bluebird day like today. It was one of those extraordinary breaks in the weather. But you remember 9/11. It occurred on the 11th of September, which is fog and hurricane backlash season in New England. And Mohammed Atta decided, he was the ringleader, that he would get on the plane that he was going to kidnap, abduct, take over in Portland. Fly from Portland to Boston, because he was of the view that the security at Boston was a lot more complex than in Portland. It may have been. But Portland, Maine in September, when you're making plans for these flights weeks in advance, you're going to get on a plane at 6:30 in the morning and not be fogged in, or in the middle of a northeaster or something of that kind. Everything broke for these terrorists. As you recall, 3 of the 4 planes, the metal detectors were set off by the muscle hijackers bringing material on. But the rule of that day was, what I'm saying is the FAA rules with respect to that were, and remember, we hadn't had any hijackings for a good while, that if the individual whose luggage triggered that metal detector got on the plane and flew, fine, let it go. So there was no notion of a suicide capacity. When I was teaching a course on anti-terrorism at Princeton about 4 or 5 years ago, a gentleman called me and said, "Fred, I'm just moved. I've retired from the FBI, and I've just moved to Princeton. Would you like me to come kibitz in your class?" I said, "Would I?" And this gentleman who had succeeded Louis Freeh from in that interim period had been on the job when 9/11 happened, and they started to look into, investigate how it could have happened. So they called 5 United 757 pilots into a room, and 5 United Airlines pilots into another room, and asked each of these groups, how do you reconstruct in your heads what happened in the cockpits those days? He said, we know perfectly well what happened. The protocol was, if a hijacker came in and said it wanted to take over the plane, you gave them the seat. So it wasn't hijackers using box cutters to kill the pilot and haul a 200-pound person out from behind the steering wheel. We gave them to them as a matter of course, because the protocol was they'd have to fly the plane and they'd have to land somewhere, and they didn't want to kill themselves. Wrong. So it's a whole new world. And I don't say all that to scare you. I just say that in terms of trying to make book on, get information about this particular situation, we perhaps have exceeded the requirements in terms of the volume of information we have gathered. but the need to get it is clear. And let me conclude by saying, I think all of us know in our heart of hearts that it's possible, even today, for somebody to slip through what has become a much denser net, so that the next time we have somebody march down to Barracks Road Shopping Center, heaven forfend, with a belt on and blow up a store and kill people, we'll, I think, begin to lean on the side of these actual protections. Having said that, I think we probably will be able to cut back on the amount of material that, as a matter of course, NSA is collecting. So over to you. Thank you for listening.
Fred, you've made the point that we have extraordinary technology that we're deploying, but my question relates to the human factor. As you pointed out, a lot depends on protocols and what people are expecting, and we have a tendency as Americans and Westerners to put the rest of the world through our mental filter and our cultural filter. What are we doing, to the extent that you can talk about this, what are we doing to escalate the expertise and the infiltration of our agents into these other cultures to get a better handle on what might be coming next that we're not going to be able to glean from the technology?
An excellent question, and let me hasten to add, I have no inside information. I've been out of the government since '98, so what you're getting is what I can pick up and educated guesses. We still have a deficiency of Arabic speakers in our country. It's been pointed out in study after study. The reason is it's a darn difficult language, and it's a language that varies from country to country. The Arabic that is spoken on the streets of Cairo is different from that you would find in the streets of in Jordan. We need to do a better job. We also need a better understanding of the cultural pressures in the region. I hate to tell you, but I go back to a day in my own service where we used to think that the only language you needed to speak in South Asia and the Middle East was the folding green. And that, of course, has long since disappeared. But what I think you're seeing is increasingly with a very tech-savvy people, a determination that this wave is going to try to get back to an Islam, whether it's the correct view of it or not, an Islam that is more grounded, as they would say it, in the thoughts of the prophets, and doesn't really depend upon Western or non-Arabic influences to the extent that they argue the current society does. Whether that's possible at all is hard for me to gauge. But certainly in order to deal with that, in order to be successful in gathering information in that part of the world, you're going to have a very strong understanding of what the totems are and what the language is. And your question is excellent, because I think we're still struggling in that regard.
Got one right here.
I won't try to pick them.
Sir, recognizing that Mr. Batten and Mr. Jefferson both believed in the Fourth Estate, do you think that Mr. Greenwald is covered as a journalist? And if not, what are the protections that the country should have for the Fourth Estate? And as a follow-up question, do you think that members of the Fourth Estate would be better, the country would be better served if members of the Fourth Estate served instead of members from the IG office? Finally, I have a question as to respect.
Wait a minute. I'm not going to remember all these questions. Your question is absolutely superb. I would think that the Fourth Estate would also feel an obligation with respect to matters of national security, potential for an outburst, that they have to report that too. And I frankly, I watched Laura Poitras on the television. I read the part in the New York Times Magazine where she described what she was up to. Greenwald a little less so. It's all very well for them to smile contentedly at the information that's come out, but it's Snowden that's sitting in tenterhooks somewhere in Russia, unable to come home. So I guess it's a smart aleck answer perhaps, but I think if the Fourth Estate felt the heavy breath of America's law enforcement and security officials and felt a need to cooperate in some fashion, it would be a better thing. But I think those days are a long time coming.
My last question is related to FISCA.
Yes.
The court. How many cases have there been where they turned down the NSA?
Well, and I'm glad you asked it because I should have said that in my opening remarks. The answer is very few, but there's a reason. There's a very good reason. And the reason is that because it's an ex parte proceeding, because it's both sides of the U.S. government, the judge says to the FBI, the presenting official, the FBI official, the CIA, I can't give you permission on the basis of this. This is thin as all get out. Take it back. I need more information if you want me to sign the warrant. That's the way the system works. It's not adversarial in that sense because the standard is, is there a likelihood that X, whom we want to tail or tap, is the agent of a foreign power, or is it not? They're not. In other words, they're not making a decision whether they're going to be cited and brought into court on a felony charge. Sir, there's somebody I know.
Fred, I don't think that Snowden is going to be captured if he stays where he is now. But let's assume that he finally decides to go to Ecuador, or Assange gets to Ecuador. I'm recalling that the Israelis snatched Eichmann off the streets in Argentina. What's the likelihood that we'll do the same?
Well, I'd like to think that were he to leave Russia, there would be an effort to get him back to these shores. And as I say, what we're talking about with respect to him, and again, don't get me going on this contractor business because obviously he's a very gifted person, but he'd been away from the flagpole a long time. Remember, a lot of where he was operating from was in Hawaii. The kind of reinforcement of the reasons for what you're doing does help. This is both good news and bad news if you're in the company of those people who have signed the oath and are working around the clock. To answer your question is, should he come to a place where we could nab him with the help of the local authorities, I would hope we would, because I think we should ask him some additional questions.
I've got one over here.
Yes, Professor Hitz, I've noticed, as everyone has, I think that the tendency for Middle Eastern peoples to have difficulty coalescing into any kind of a united movement. We currently have this ISIL or ISIS, whatever it's called, and it has drawn some people. It's adding a little mass as it grows. What are the chances that that will continue, and versus the chances that the strong men who control these populations and have kept them down for generations will get control of the situation once again?
I think it's an excellent question, and once again, it's not my area of expertise. I'm working on the same information you're working on. I think there's a tendency to balkanize now, and I think there are different groups of hostiles in different areas. We're looking now, for example, at what's going on in Turkey. It surprises me enormously that Turkey is sort of turning a cold shoulder to the blandishments of President Obama and others in the West to get hold of this. They have the most to lose. Their border is absolutely porous, but I guess they've decided, just as you stated, there are too many of them and not enough of us, and they're going to have to cooperate. Think of the Turks and their non-relationship with their own Kurds over a long period of time. It was out of Turkey, after all, that both of these areas of real contention was created. Mesopotamia in the case of Iraq, etc., and Syria, Lebanon, which the French took over. Sykes-Picot in 1916 was the treaty that brought that about. So we're really seeing sort of the follow-on to a lot of experiments in the region as to governance, but ones that haven't stuck. And now there seems to be a return to the good book, to doing it in an ancient way. And yet, what's that going to do, for example, to the female populations in these areas? Are they going to go back into the house? What is it going to do to the school-age children who are not perhaps going to get the benefit of modern schooling? The implications of Syria and Iraq, Mesopotamia becoming horizontal and just fighting continually are very ugly indeed. And I'm not sure that any of us are getting at it by, striking the leaders from the air. Maybe that's an opening go, but I'm just as reluctant as all of you, I'm sure, would be to putting American boots on the ground again, because I consider it to be, as you suggest, at this point, a mess, insoluble.
Got 2 questions
here. Okay.
What the lady referred to here with her very insightful question is called human intelligence, which you know a whole lot about, Fred, but very difficult to get human in that part of the world because so much of the society is closed. There's so much differential between among the cultures there, and we don't have enough Arabic speakers, as you say, and it's a real tough nut to crack. It'd be so much better if we had a lot more human than we do that we could rely on, but that's the way it is. But I know that there are people like Eric and me here who have had high-level clearances for many, many years as part of the intelligence world, and we all had to sign a document that said we would not divulge secrets of this country without a penalty of $10,000 fine and 10 years in prison. And to do so otherwise is absolutely treason, and that's where Mr. Snowden stands, in my opinion.
Fred, so I don't remember the specifics, but there have been instances in front of Congress where heads of intelligence have not exactly been forthcoming on what the NSA was collecting. Congress is supposed to have oversight on these things. On the other hand, in the era of big data, when technology allows you more and more to look for ever smaller needles in the haystacks, are you confident that we actually have sufficient oversight to balance the need for finding terrorists and so forth and so on with our freedoms?
That's an excellent question, Bob, and the short answer is no. If you will recall that one of the major recommendations of the 9/11 Commission, that report I referred to you earlier, was that the whole business of congressional oversight of the intelligence world was mixed up, screwed up, and needed to be changed, needed to be worked out. Let me tell you the different authorities to whom NSA reports. Obviously, the NSA reports the agency itself, and it's enormous. It's an enormous complex, enormously gifted people in Fort Meade, to the director of the National Security Agency. And whether you think General Alexander had stayed on too long or not, he was an extraordinarily capable person. But then they go up through that route to the deputy for the Secretary of Defense, who's in charge of intelligence programs. That's one. They also go to the Director of National Intelligence, General Clapper, who is another player. So before you even get out of the executive branch, you've got a number of masters, many of whom represent branches of the uniformed military, and they want to make doggone sure, as I would in their shoes, that NSA support, signals intelligence support, exists for their units that are in the field. Lots of masters. After 9/11, lots of money, lots of confusion, lots of misdirection, the direction from the executive branch without knowing the full detail, and this is what Snowden was trying to point out, had just gone over the top. We were collecting enormous amounts of material, as I say, in this metadata form. We weren't reading all these messages, but we were storing them up, 5 years worth, and eventually going to stick them out in this unit in southern Utah. Please don't take my remarks as saying that all of this is justified by the circumstances we find ourselves in. But I think if we want to tailor it back, if we want to cut it back, and I think we do, we want to do it in a systematic and intelligent way so we don't throw the baby out with the bath. And I think it's going to come because we're spending between $9 and $12 billion on counterterrorism in the intelligence budget every year. That's a lot of dough.
I'm sure that you're aware that ALCU has sent somebody over to interview Snowden in Russia, and they have ALCU has written him up as a hero. How would you address the powers that be at ALCU who has put Snowden on this pedestal?
Well, again, I can see we're in a period now where the sort of the delight, the pleasure at knowing what has been revealed in the Snowden revelations is sort of overwhelming the second thought of what is it that we are giving up? What is it that our adversaries are going to be able to glean from this and use against us? I think my answer to that would be, and this came up in an earlier question, Bob's question, I think it's going to be incumbent after this midterm election for the intelligence committees to get down to business and look this over. Now, what I didn't finish in saying is, in terms of the NSA's overseers, the Armed Services Committees have a big role. It isn't the intelligence committees as such. It's the Armed Services Committees. So you've got an awful lot of people stirring the pot. The Armed Services Committees would insist on a role with NSA because it's through them that the Army has reconnaissance, intelligence capabilities surrounding troops that they send to the field. Obviously, they want to know that we're collecting everything we can. So I guess if what we get out of Snowden is we're spending a heck of a lot of money without any clear advantage, somebody's going to have to take a look at that problem and sort it through authoritatively. And I don't think I'd leave that to the ACLU.
Hi. I'd like to get a point cleared up with regard to NSA's access to conversations and so forth. We know that NSA records metadata and only accesses communications subject to court order. Okay. What's not clear to me is whether they actually store the communications without the court order and only access it after they have the court order, or do they only store it after they have obtained the court order?
No, I think actually, and I could be wrong on this, I think they store the material they collect. And that's the thing that's taking so much space. A lot more entities are up on the airwaves communicating, and so they're collecting that material. Remember, we looked right after 9/11 and said, "Holy mackerel! Those were all foreigners that were on those planes." What about people in the United States who have pro-Islam views? Have we got any way of finding out what they're up to? That's where this program got started. It was conversations overseas from suspected Al-Qaeda nodes into the United States, people whom we may never have heard of. And we're holding on to that in metadata form until the sheet is filled out a little bit more to determine whether or not these are potentially persons who will act against the interests of the United States. I don't know if that gets at your question, but I think there's enough data that they could collect in this metadata form that would be perceived as meeting that requirement without having to add any more. And as you suggest, it's an enormous amount of data.
So you don't believe that they're recording conversations unless they get a court order based on the analysis of metadata?
I've been around the U.S. government law too long, not to say never, but all I can tell you is I don't believe they are supposed to. And maybe that's a good point to bring up, because I would not take Snowden's witness as based on some knowledge of the hostile nature of NSA personnel towards communications. The NSA guys, gals are doing their job. And sloppiness maybe comes in, and that's an issue. But to be actually listening to conversations that they have no business listening to, they got too damn much else work to do. That's the way I look at it.
Yes. It's clear that Mr. Snowden has released classified information, which is illegal based on what he's signed and so on and so forth.
Exactly, what he agreed to when he went
so
to...
my question is, the people that now have the information and are releasing it with, it seems like impunity, what happens, or is there anything that, what's to stop them from continuing to release highly classified information? And if they do, what do we do about that?
You mean the people that will have read the stories that came from the material that he took, that kind of thing?
As you said, he's pre-positioned this information, and they're
going
through it and then printing it in the news.
Right.
So it's clear if he would do that, he'd be, in jail. They're not. Why is that?
Sounds to me like you're going after the Fourth Estate again. And I think you have a good point. And the answer is, until I see a law case brought against Greenwald or to Poitras, the answer to your question would have to be they've gotten away with stolen goods, so to speak. And
so there's no legal...
Yes, there is. And I'm so... We do. And I don't... so that's... My answer to your question is incomplete. I don't know why that isn't on that particular... in that particular rubric to permit... and maybe what happens is Poitras and Greenwald have positioned themselves as facilitators rather than manipulators of the stuff. Yeah, well, I'm stumped.
I think I have the next question. You caught my attention with your opening remarks about Snowden being captured and turned. And I was wondering if you would elaborate on what you meant when you were alluding to his relationship with Putin.
I was being a smart aleck. It strikes me as a little bit coincidental that from Hong Kong he just found his way to Moscow, and then his time ran out on the temporary visa that he had sitting in the airport, and he's there on a longer term. I think there are a lot of things we don't know about Mr. Snowden, but he's there and not in the Ecuadorian embassy. And, it's always possible. He's a real running sore as far as the U.S. government is concerned. We'd like to get him back. And Putin says, you ain't going to get him back. You don't have to. I haven't got enough to go on. It is possible that as he became more disillusioned with the way the United States was running its business, that he turned to somebody like Putin. But I have no evidence of it. it just stinks.
Professor Hitt, at the outset, you advised Edward Snowden to turn himself in, and I think there's compelling legal reasons for him not to do so, not to accept your advice. The reason being that as the law is currently written, he cannot mount an exigency or motive defense. And clearly, as this gentleman said, he's violated law, so the only defense he could possibly make would be it's exigent. He was violating the law to prevent something worse from happening. If he's, am I correct, is he not allowed to mount the defense and he'd face certain guilt here?
Yeah, it's a good point, the technicality. I think he'd have to, as I say, I put it in terms of throwing himself on the mercy of the court, and it's too late now. There ain't no mercy. And but the point being that he'd make out a case that what's going on in his view was a tremendous waste of money, a horrific misapplication of resources, unnecessary, blah, 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 and maybe there would be some sympathy. I think he's missed that opportunity. As I said, what I really thought might have been the best route was to go to his NSA IG, somebody in the building, so to speak, and say, you know, this is just ridiculous. I work on this. We're collecting stuff that is just so far away from the goal that we originally set. We're wasting money and blah blah blah. Now, skeptics will come back and say, say, well, the IG says you're just having a bad day, Buster. Go back to the ranks. But I would like to have seen that kind of action taken before he gave it to the press. And I would suspect, were he to be tried, there would have to be some indication that there was a consequence, a harmful consequence to the information he actually revealed, rather than the fact of. Remember, he's just saying we're collecting, mountain loads of this metadata material. It's terribly expensive to do it, and it just doesn't make any sense. That in itself is not, yes, it harms the national interest, I should suppose, for it to come out that way, but it isn't as if he were saying, and there's Joe Blow in that particular country, and this is what he's doing. I was just trying to think with your help of, would it be possible for him to have recognized this anguish that he felt at collecting too much in a way that was legitimate and positive, rather than just throwing it in the press. Because NSA, I think, as I said earlier, I think NSA's take here, how much they're going to do, is going to have to be reviewed. It's too darned expensive for what they're getting. And maybe that'll happen in the fullness of time. But you and I both know it's unlikely to happen if tomorrow, heaven forfend, we're hit by another terrorist tragedy. That's the world we live in, sadly. And as I say, you saw in the New York Times today, Apple is going to create an iPhone that can't be bugged, period.
First, thank you very much for taking the time to address all our lifetime learners here today. You just now hit upon my question, and that was our Apple Corporation's decision to make the new iPhone 6, which is sold all over the world to millions of people in many countries with various interests in this whole situation, to encrypt the data that flows over those phones. Do you have an initial sort of impression or feeling in your mind as to how this is going to change the whole meta and other data accumulation? It's really something.
At the very least, it's going to complicate it enormously, because we've already know that these terrorist groups are quite skilled at using cell phones, all of these things. So it's just another issue out there where we're going to be hard-pressed. But you and I both know what Apple would say to that. If we don't sell it to them, then the Japanese or the Europeans are going to sell them phones that they can't break. Rock in a hard place, I'd say, but I hate to see them doing that. It does, however, illustrate the fact that gaining and holding information in this era is a tough job. And it gets back to what we said earlier. We've got to find ways to manage these frustrations in the Middle East so that they aren't directed towards us or towards the West, and we can coexist. But it's pretty tough when you've got a group that's moving in the direction they appear to be moving now, which is, grab a hostage and cut their throat.
We've got time for 2 more questions.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting talk today. I was wondering if you could talk more, though, about the sort of the broader the constitutional context that I think Snowden perceived that he was acting in that I can't remember the name of the other fellow. There was someone named Drake who was a career
Right.
CIA.
Yeah.
And my understanding of
Tom Drake.
Tom Drake, okay.
And Tom Drake, I got involved in that case a little bit. Let me just clear that up. Tom Drake was in a different situation. He was whistleblowing on a procurement that NSA had made, and really it turned out they shouldn't have made it. It didn't make any sense in a business way, et cetera, et cetera. He wasn't selling secrets to a foreign government. Indeed, he was acting for you and me, the taxpayers, and trying to save dough, and he was badly roughed up. And of course, that's the trouble. If you build a mechanism where communication with the outside is the rare exception and not the rule, people aren't used to, having tolerance for that sort of thing. But I don't think we're seeing that in the Snowden case, because the system he's put up to get this information out is a lot more extensive. He's had helpers.
No, but I mean, my understanding of Drake and the other fellow is that they were career CIA or intelligence people.
Career NSA.
NSA.
Yeah.
And they did go through the chain of command
Yes, they did.
to report their fears that there were abuses going on.
Right.
And
we were buying something we didn't need to buy.
Right. But I mean, aside from the nature of it, though, but when they went through the chain of command, their careers were destroyed and they weren't listened to.
Yeah.
And then the second, I guess.
And so your point very, very accurately is to say, if somebody knows about a Drake case and is thinking about going to the IG and this is what happens, they're going to think again.
Well, it's kind of
that's unfortunate.
Well, kind of a two-part. That my understanding of Snowden's motivation and context was that he had seen these fellow intelligence officers try and go through the chain of command and were ignored and destroyed, their careers destroyed. And then he had also seen, whether it was Alexander or Clapper, I don't remember the other fellow's comment, not been completely forthcoming to the congressional oversight. I mean, generally conceded that they lied to Congress. So I think my perception of Snowden was that he felt like the normal courses of action open to him really were precluded, and if the intelligence community really was greatly overstepping constitutional boundaries, it's unclear to me what alternative someone in his position would have done.
Well, I'd say on your last point, maybe overstepping congressional boundaries, but spending more money than we had to in this particular thing, wasting.
It's not about money.
Well, if it's metadata, I might have an argument with you. If you have metadata and you don't have access to the substance of what's being said, unless you've got a cause and unless you've gone through the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, I think that's slightly different. But I think your point is a good one in this sense. He was too far at the end of the pipeline for a guy that was as able as he. A contractor in Hawaii, that's a long ways from Maryland, Fort Meade. And number one, any of his colleagues who saw him getting restive about matters of this kind should have said, we've got to find a way to talk to Snowden, find out what his beef is, see if there's an answer to it. Because he obviously got alienated. And what I think we'll find is that he came into the hands of these aggressive reporters who egged him on to go. And he went, and he's now in Moscow, and they're sitting in their editorial offices smiling broadly as they see what they've unleashed on the world. I don't particularly like that.
Got time for one more question?
See, I tend to filibuster, don't I?
Professor,
Sorry.
Thank you very much for speaking with us today. And I think you've just hit the tip of an iceberg in terms of the collection of data, because there are many other types of data, such as email data, cell phone triangulation data, and many, many other forms that may or may not be collected by the NSA. I think there are some court cases pending on it. And I don't know what's being collected, and I don't think the American people know or will be allowed to know what kind of data is being collected, anywhere from highway police license plate recognition data and all other kinds of locator data that may be centralized. And whether this is worthwhile is conjectural, but I think it's worth discussing. But my question was that recently the New York Times had an article by James Banford on the acquisition by a foreign intelligence service of unminimized data from the NSA, which purported to contain content and possibly content of people who weren't necessarily being surveilled under the authorization of the intelligence court. So I wonder if you could, if you're familiar with that article, and whether you could comment at all on its nature.
I saw it. It didn't surprise me in the sense that, things can get out of the loop. It's the kind of thing that ought to be looked at very hard by NSA in the IG office, and also by the Hill to determine whether or not this was out of bounds. But you're right, you're playing with fire in this area. And yet the safeguards are, for the most part, hardworking people who know what their jobs are and don't want to, wouldn't be tempted to go across the line. That having been said, what Snowden's talking about, when you cut it right down to the base, is we're spending too darn much money on this, and we've been given a fat hog, and we're not exercising any discipline and restraint in what it is that we're going after on the basis of what we need to know. At least I would like to think that's what his view is, and it just seems to me a shame that he had to go out in this fashion to do it, because the danger is that on the rebound they'll throw the baby out with the bath. That's the way America works. We lurch to one side and then we lurch back. And one hoped that the oversight committees would help with that they would have jumped into it. And and we'll end on this. It's a very sad note, but it's one that's coming down the pike. We have yet to read the Senate Select Committee report on CIA hostile interrogations. Wait till you read that one. It's going to curl your hair. I can just smell it. We've never been, the agency has never, we haven't been in the interrogation business since the Vietnam War. We were going out for 2-week periods of training to learn how to interrogate, and I'm sure we did some awful things. And that's going to be out there when they release that report after the election. And it's just, it's a shame. You sigh, but S happens, as they say. And on that note, you
Thank you all so much for coming today, and thank you, Professor Fred Hitz, for a great talk. On behalf of Lifetime Learning and the Alumni Association, I want to give you a little gift and say thank you so much. There are books for sale.
Go Who's!